Hello, I think our speakers and panelists all have joined. So let us just formally begin with this presentation. A very good afternoon to all of you. ICID welcomes you to this research seminar on impact of carbon border adjustment mechanism (CBAM) on steel decarbonization in India, which will be presented jointly by Professor Kasturi Das from IMT Ghaziabad and Professor Kaushik Ranjan Bandyopadhyay from IIM Lucknow. As you all know, ICID has been hosting a series of webinars on significant issues around the theme of industrial development in India for the last 4 years. And today's webinar is a part of these series that shall focus exclusively on the issue of green industrialization. The research paper we will discuss today shall focus specifically on the impact of carbon border adjustment mechanism (CBAM) on decarbonization in Indian steel industry that happens to be one of the hard to abate sectors of India to which CBAM is applicable. CBAM has been introduced in October 2023 as a carbon regulation on imports in European Union, and this regulation has a significant importance for India, given that EU was India's largest trading partner in 2023. And CBAM is important mainly because of its implications for trade dynamics and India's economic growth and green transition pathways. So, before we formally proceed with this presentation on a very relevant issue, let me share a brief introduction of the authors on and our three distinguished panelists. I can see all of them have joined. So let me just start with the introductions. The first author, Professor Kasturi Das from Institute of Management Technology, Ghaziabad. She was the Shivning Fellow at the University of Oxford in 2019. Also, she was a Ford Fellow at the University of Cambridge in 2007. Uh, the Economic and Social Research Council's Governance of Clean Development Visiting Fellow at University of East Anglia in 2011. She is an accomplished economist and an expert trade and climate policy practitioner and an educator with more than 2 decades of research and policy advisory experience. She has been serving as a member of the High Level Advisory Committee on Trade and Environment of the Department of Commerce, Government of India. Her co-author, Professor Kaushik Ranjan Bandyopadhyay, is presently professor at IIM Lucknow. He has more than 2 decades of experience in academic and policy research and has been associated with the International Institute of Sustainable Development as a principal policy advisor. He is a member of Advisory Committee on Green Entrepreneurship Council, CII Godrej Green Business Center, member of FICCI National Task Force on ESG, a steering committee member of Asia Pacific Resource Center of UN Global Compact Network of India, and has contributed research and policy inputs to multiple important committees and projects on environment and decarbonization issues. And some of his recent projects have specifically focused on implications of CBAM on Indian steel sector. Now I move to our three panelists. We have a set of three eminent panelists today to discuss the presentation and to reflect on the broader theme of today's presentation. Our first panelist is Dr. Prerna Prabhakar, who is a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress with research expertise on trade, sustainability, and industrial policy issues. Besides being a noted columnist in leading newspapers, she has worked on multiple research projects on trade and environmental issues with University of Delhi RIS, Center for WTO Studies, and South Asian Network for Development and Environment Economics. Our second panelist is Ms. Aparna Sharma, who is a program lead at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW. She presently co-leads the carbon market team under the low carbon economy vertical of CEW, and her research has focused on the Indian carbon market policy landscape. She is a known public policy professional with around 10 years of research experience in international trade, FDI, and economic cooperation issues. Our third panelist is Dr. Anjali Tandon, who is an associate professor from ISID and also my faculty senior. With an academic work experience of 20 years, she is a known research and policy expert on the issues of international trade, FDI, energy, industry, and domestic agriculture, and has authored several academic papers and reputed journals around these themes. I welcome both my paper presenters and the three distinguished panelists once again. And with these words, let us formally move to the paper presentation. I request Professor Kasturi Das and Professor Kaushik to proceed with their presentation. They may share their slides. The time allocation shall be 30 minutes for the presentation and 10 minutes to each panelist, which will be followed by an open discussion. So the floor is open to Kasturi.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Swati, for this very kind introduction, and to ISIT, Professor Nagesh Kumar, and the entire team at ISIT for inviting us to share our research and also to engage in conversation with our fellow esteemed co-panelists. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting session going forward. I hope the slides are visible.
Yes,
ma'am.
yeah.
Okay. So without much ado, and given the time constraint we have, let me straight away get into the presentation mode and share with you that this particular paper that we are going to share today, it was released in a top journal called International Environmental Agreement, Politics, Law and Economics. In January 2025, it was published as part of a wider special issue on external dimensions of European Union's Green Deal. The special issue in print as well as online format in the entire issue got published in June 2025. Now, before getting into our research, we do not know that how far everyone who are participating in this event are aware of the issues of carbon leakage and why carbon border adjustment mechanism. So we thought that we'll start a little bit with an introduction of some of the basics, very briefly. So what is carbon leakage? Now, carbon leakage refers to a phenomena that occurs when greenhouse gas emission reductions efforts by a particular jurisdiction through, say, carbon pricing or other different ways of tackling carbon emissions get negated at least partially as a result of lack of similar pricing initiatives elsewhere in the world. So that is the whole idea of the carbon leakage. And the risk of carbon leakage is particularly relevant for emission intensive and trade export sectors like steel, aluminium, cement, and all that. So European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism has been introduced as part of the European Green Deal as a way of tackling carbon leakage, given that EU is trying to stringently apply its carbon pricing and strengthen these measures under the Green Deal. How it works? So if you look at this particular graphic, we have taken from the EU itself. There is a website on carbon border adjustment mechanism. I have taken it from there. So here you can see that there are two panels here. One indicates the production that is happening within European Union, that is on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see imported products, say steel. We are talking about the same items being produced in EU vis-a-vis imported in EU from elsewhere. Now, since steel is an emission-intensive sector which is covered under European Union emission trading scheme, so you can see on the left-hand side that under the steel sector, the installations which are covered, they have to buy emission allowances under the European Union emission trading scheme, which is a cap and trade system. Now think of the right side. If there are imports that are coming from places where there are not similar carbon pricing mechanisms that are being applied, then of course there would be difference in terms of the price of carbon paid under EU ETS by the steel players who are producing in EU vis-a-vis those who are producing elsewhere and not facing similar carbon pricing. Now, when I say similar carbon pricing, it could be that some carbon pricing is there, but not exactly equal extent of carbon pricing, or it could be that there is no carbon pricing at all. So all those cases would indicate that it's a lack of similar carbon pricing between EU and other countries. So if that happens, so you can see that the level playing, as per the conceptualization of European Union, there is no level playing field between the European Union steel producers vis-a-vis those who are exporting to EU but not facing similar carbon pricing. Now, in order to address this kind of lack of parity in terms of carbon pricing, whereas they are facing the same EU market, CBAM is being introduced. And the whole idea is that the importers who are importing from countries where there is lack of similar carbon pricing in the covered sectors, they would have to buy what is called CBAM certificates, which in a way will mirror the European Union ETS allowances. How it will mirror and what are the nitty-gritty details of those application and implementation, those are very complex things, and if there is time, we can explain those at a later stage. Now, CBAM covers the following sectors. In principle, if you look at all the imports in these sectors that are coming to EU are covered under CBAM. However, there are some exceptions in terms of those countries or those kinds of jurisdictions which are intertwined with the EU ETS. They have been exempted. CBAM has been introduced in 2 phases. It is already running the transitional phase, which is going to end very soon. We are in December 2025, and that is the month when the transition phase is going to get over. And from January 2026, EU CBAM will be running in full-fledged manner. Now, what is the difference between this transitional phase vis-a-vis the definitive phase? In the transitional phase, importers were asked to just collect data, all the relevant data under CBAM, which are required for application of CBAM. Only those data had to be collected. And of course, from where do you get the data? You have to collect those data from the places from where and the installations from where you are importing. So quite obviously, the burden of collecting and submitting those data would fall upon the exporters, like the exporters of steels from India. Now, what is the definitive phase? Definitive phase is a phase when the CBAM would be applied in a full-fledged manner. Not only the data would be collected, but the carbon pricing under CBAM would also be applied. And that is going to start in January next year. Now, we have already talked about the main purpose that EU has defined as the objective of CBAM, which is tackling the carbon leakage. However, there is also a second purpose, and that is to encourage enhanced decarbonization in EU's trading partners. And it is a second objective that is the point of departure of our study that we are going to present now. Now, what is the objective and what is the main research question that we tried to address in this study? The research question is, will CBAM really encourage enhanced decarbonization in the hard-to-abate sectors in EU's key trading partners, say India and other countries who are exporting to EU in a big way, particularly those in the global south? That is the main research question we tried to address. Why focus on steel industry and why India? I'd request Kaushik to take it forward from here. Kaushik, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. At the foremost, thank you, Kasturi. And thank you, Swati, for that kind and nice introductions. Thanks to Professor Nagesh Kumar for giving us an opportunity to present our research and our findings and share with the broad audience. And I look forward to the discussions, particularly the panel discussions and the open discussion afterwards. So, Kasturi, if you could please go on to the next slide. Yeah, so one of the important why this issue is, just hold on for a second. Yeah, now I can see this. So why this steel sector is important, because, and why decarbonization of the steel sector is important, because the direct greenhouse gas from the industrial sector in itself actually accounts for 21% of the global emissions, and around 71% of the industrial emissions are actually attributed to the heavy industrial sectors, which include steel at the most. So among all the CBAM covered sectors which Kasturi has talked about, steel is the highest emitter. So it's responsible for about 8% of the global greenhouse gas emission, and that is why it comes in the forefront. So it's quite obvious that in order to actually meet the Paris Agreement goal, the emission from the steel sector needs to fall substantially, and IEA has estimated, IEA is International Energy Agency, it has estimated in 2020 that it has to fall by 50%. In other words, the steel is a backbone of any country. So you naturally need to decouple the growth from the emissions when it comes to steel sector. That's precisely the point that I'm making here in these slides. Could you please go to the next slide? So if you look at production of the steel, I think the world production of the steel comes to be around close to 2 billions, 1.8 billions actually, of which 1 billion is actually made up by China. India comes a distant second, around 8%, but still it is critical because of the emission intensity that Indian steel sector actually has. So I think just because of China, India, and Japan, the entire production in, I think, in Asia and Oceania comprises about 1.4 billions of the entire 1.8 billions of the world production of the steels. And you can very well understand that the role of Asia and Oceania particularly is very critical in the decarbonization of the steel sector. Next slide, please. Now, why India? The second largest producer, as I've shown right now, although it's a distant second, which you could see from the graph that I've shown in the previous slide. And its steel production is actually growing in an unabated manner. It's on a continuous growth path because of the fact that it's a core pillar of the country's most infrastructural sectors and most of the priority sectors that we have in the country. So almost, and there's an estimate which has been made that by 2050, that almost 1/5 of the global steel production is projected to be in India. And if I look at the current intensity of the steel sector, it's around 2.54 ton of carbon dioxide per tons of crude steel, which is far, far higher than the global average of 1.85 tons of carbon dioxide per tons of crude steel. And this is largely attributed to the fact that the lion's share of the steel is produced in the blast furnace and oxidized furnace, basically the iron making and the steel making. I'll come to that at a later stage. It also accounts, as I've said, that because it's a backbone, because it accounts for 2% of India's gross domestic product. So it's critical. So steel is one of the leading export sectors in India also, and you happen to have remained the top destination of the country's steel export. Next slide, please. So I think I'll just now pass this on to Kasturi to explain the review of the literature that we have gone through and what exactly are the research gaps that we have found out. And post that, I think she'll take over. I'll come back once again when we discuss about the salient features of the steel industry in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaushik. Let me take it forward from here. So, if you look at the literature on CBAM or border carbon adjustment, why I'm using these two terms? First, let me explain. Border carbon adjustment is a term which has traditionally been used to indicate that this kind of measure. And we have been working, and I can tell you that many of us, in this field who have been working for more than 2-3 decades on border carbon adjustment. However, those were more like academic and policy-oriented discussion, but it was not so much application-oriented. However, when European Union came up with its carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a border carbon adjustment measure, it is the first time that they introduced or coined this term, carbon border adjustment mechanism or CBAM. So this term CBAM may be attributable to European Union. With the introduction of CBAM, when the proposal came, this was the first time that anywhere in the world this kind of measure was getting implemented and introduced, and that actually created a scenario that it became a particular measure which is very important not only for academics, not only for policymakers, but also for the industry and practitioners. However, here I'm showing a lot of literature that was actually related to CBAM that we could find out. And you can see that there are different kinds of literature. To cut a long story short, we could not find any study, despite the fact that you introduced the CBAM, we could not find when we started this work. Back then, there was no such study that looked at what are the perspectives of the real stakeholders, what are they doing and how they are tackling this thing in a country like India, which is a developing country and has a huge trade interest in the European Union in sectors like steel. So that was the point of departure of our study. So if we look at the novelty of the study in terms of academic as well as practice-oriented literature, one is the conceptual framework and the other is methodology. As I already told you that this is the first of its kind study that looked at the stakeholders' perspective on steel decarbonization in India and how it is getting impacted by European Union CBAM. So that is one of the differentiator. But we not only did it just like collecting interviews, etc. There is a proper conceptual framework that is underlying the study, and we had drawn the conceptual framework from what Professor Anu Bradford of Columbia University has defined as the Brussels effect. So we will explain the Brussels effect briefly shortly. But let me tell you that although there have been a lot of literature on Brussels effect and that have tried to explore whether Brussels effect holds good, we could not find any literature that looked at impact of CBAM on its trading partners of European Union through the lens of the Brussels effect. So that is also one of the differentiator. Now, let me explain the Brussels effect. Now, the whole idea, and here I'm showing you the book that from where we studied the Brussels effect and tried to apply it here by Professor Bradford. The whole idea, if we put it very briefly, in the context of CBAM, for instance, as I said, that European Union is first to come up with this kind of measure, but EU has been front runner in various different fields in terms of regulatory developments. It is not only about CBAM, but also different other environment-related areas, and there are other different areas in which EU has been a front runner. And here I can show you the different areas where EU has been a front runner, and Brussels effect, whether these hold good in this kind of areas like competition policy, data privacy, digital economy, and so on. There have been many literature who have tried to explore the application of Brussels effect in these fields. However, we could not find any such study in the context of EU CBAM. Now, coming back to the conceptualization of the Brussels effect, the whole idea is that suppose that EU has come up with its carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now think of the exporting companies in India who are already exporting to EU, and they are now facing the stringent CBAM measure. Now the question arises that what would be their approach? Brussels effect would indicate that their approach could be that they would take attempt, and measures to meet the CBAM requirement and go for expedited way of decarbonizing their production. And if they do so, obviously that would involve a lot of cost and different initiatives they have to undertake. Now, if that happens, if that is what they do and they respond to CBAM like that, then that means that they would, in the domestic context or in other markets where there is no such thing as CBAM, they would face competition vis-a-vis other players who are not exporting to EU market, and as a result, they are not facing CBAM and under no pressure to go for expediting their decarbonization process. Now, if that happens, then obviously these players from India who are trying to, export to CBAM, export to EU, and that's why, undertake more advanced decarbonization measures, they would face lack of level playing field. Now, what would be their response? If we go by Professor Bradford's idea, she would tell us that they would actually lobby with their domestic government, say here in India, and try to see that the government of India also comes up with regulation which mimics the EU CBAM. Now, why would they do that? They would do that because if that happens in the Indian market, then other players who are competing with them in the Indian market would also be under pressure to go for advanced decarbonization measure. So there will be the playing field in the Indian market would be more level. So that is the whole idea of the Brussels effect. So what is happening in the process? Let us explain it very clearly. Here, we are not talking about EU getting into any kind of policy level or collaborative discussion with India. Brussels effect is working through the business as well as the market. Just because there are exporters who are interested in exporting to EU and they are facing CBAM and they go for advanced decarbonization, they would back here impose pressure on their government to go for more stringent regulatory measures which would mimic CBAM. So in the process, India would come up with a measure in the carbon pricing space, which would be quite similar to CBAM or at least the carbon pricing imposed by CBAM. That is the whole idea of the Brussels effect. Now the question arises that is it something that we get to see in the Indian context? That is something we try to explore in our study. And we do it at two levels, at the company level as well as at the government and policymakers level. Now, what is the methodology? Very briefly, it is a qualitative methodology, so we collected data from a closed-door, invitation-only focus group discussion kind of event. And also we went, after that, we went back to different key informants. And there are, 43 interviewees that we reached out to in online as well as offline mode, wherever applicable. And we, of course, introduced some checks and balances due to paucity of time. I'm not getting into details. Coming to data sources, of course, those are the sources of our primary data and our qualitative work, but we have also collected secondary data from Ministry of Commerce and Industry of Government of India regarding trade data, and also we have undertaken extensive study of the secondary literature. Coming to the primary key informants, you can see that we have reached out to all kinds of key informants, and these are all very senior and experienced professionals who could actually give us the right kind of information about how they are dealing with CBAM and what it means for the Indian steel sector. So here, we would like to mention that we did undertake these interviews in Chatham House following the Chatham House rule. So in our paper also, we have not disclosed their names, but however, we have given this kind of way of indicating different categories of stakeholders, which I am just running. For further details, you can please go back to our paper, which we will be sharing here shortly. Now, what are the salient features of the steel industry in India? Okay, so let me now hand it over to Kaushik to take it forward from here.
Yeah, I'll just be a little bit quicker. So I think, as I have mentioned earlier, that the emission intensity of the steel sector is around 2.54 tons of carbon dioxide per tons of crude steel. And if I really want to divide it and try to understand that why the emission intensity is so much, and it's why so much high as compared to the global average emission intensity, then we have to actually dissect it into the different sectors, which is like we have a primary steel sectors, which are producing the crude steels and finished steel. Then we have the secondary steel sectors, which are actually dominated by the small and medium enterprises. And I mean, in the primary sector, the steel is produced by using the blast furnace, oxygen furnace routes, which is for production of the iron. And for steel, I won't go into the details, but if you have any kind of questions for clarity, you can always get back to me or Kasturi for the details. So BFOF actually accounts for the largest emission intensity, and that's why the emission intensity is so high. Then if we go to the other part of the story, in terms of secondary steel sector, we have the direct reduced iron electric furnace, which is called EAF short, and they uses both scrap and DRI. And similarly, we have the induction furnace. However, the emission intensity of the induction furnace tends to be a little bit higher as compared to the electric arc furnace. Because of the higher energy consumptions in induction furnace, they also use a mix of scrap and DRI, actually. So could you please go to the next slide? Yeah, so I think before we really just jump into the problem of what implications will CBAM have on steel decarbonization in India and why is it so challenging, one needs to understand the key barriers that are there in terms of steel decarbonization. So you already know that in 2020, towards the end of 2020, Steel has already come out with a huge document explaining all the technologies, all the barriers, and all the enablers. But here I'm just summarizing few of the key barriers. And if we just try to look at it, We have barriers from the supply side, which basically involves the raw material and the energy that is being used for the production of steel. And why this is a problem? Because of the fact that the coal and largely the good quality coal is not available in India, it's imported. We don't have adequate quality of natural gas, that is also imported. We have a problem with scrap because we don't have it in adequate quantity. And even if we are planning to import it, there are questions of restrictions that are being imposed by all the countries, and we don't have quality scrap available. Coming to the technology, and this is the three main issues, but we are also exploring the auxiliary fuel and alternate fuel. I don't want to go into in details. We have the technological problems because CCUS is currently not in the commercially viable stage. If you're looking at, for instance, the electrolyzer in production of the hydrogen, that is also is in a trial stage, in a pilot stage, and obviously is not commercially viable. These are some of the key supply side barriers. In the demand side barriers, if you're actually thinking in terms of producing the green steel or a low carbon steel, because India has come out with a taxonomy of green steel, which looks at how green the steel is, and it's defined in terms of the emission intensity, carbon dioxide emission intensity, right? So I think is that even if we produce green steel, who will be the takers? Is there a market for that? And so, I mean, even if you're just producing it for you, I mean, if you're trying to transform your entire industry, there has to be a market for that. So there is no market security unless and until there's a big push from the government side in terms of public procurement. That's not going to happen so soon. So I think there's a big issue there in terms of why the willingness to pay and whether there are takers for that. Coming to the investment part, most of the projects in integrating the technology is largely not bankable. And in fact, there is it's a very capex heavy sector, and it's a cyclical sector. The revenue is also cyclical, and you know that it has already gone through a debt stress in the past. So naturally, the bankability of the project is under questions, and there's lack of international finance, which is also not forthcoming, adding to the problem. Coming to the social barriers, that's a major one, which I think is one of the issues which is leading to the findings of our problem, findings of our hypothesis. This is because the sector consists of large and small players. Large means the integrated steel players, small players mean the small and medium scale industries. Now, these guys, the small and medium scale industries, neither have the technological know-how, nor do they have the capacity, nor do they have the resources, nor do they have the finances, nor do they have the ability for the knowledge with respect to the documentations, which is not at a level playing field with ISPs. That's a huge issue, in fact, which we are currently grappling with in the Indian context. Might be that even if CBAM comes, the ISPs might be able to deal with it better. But coming to the small and medium scale industries, they are in a deep soup, and it's not very easy. They're in a puddle of water, and it's not very easy to get out of it so soon. So I'm ending it here. I'm passing it on to Kasturi. She can take it over.
Thank you, Kaushik. Let me take it forward. So these are some of the targets that the government India set for the country, which is like, in Glasgow COP about net zero, and steel industry is also aligning as per that. Now, what are the findings of our study regarding potential exposure of India steel export to CBAM? And here I'm just running it very fast because we are running short of time. Here you can see, the trade data. The figure depicts that the share of EU in India's total world export of steel has shown an upward movement, particularly since financial year 2021-2022, reaching 31% in 23-24. Recent data I'd like to mention indicate that there has been some drop this year, most recently, but this data is taken from our study. That's why, we are not updating that data. Here you can see the figure shows that over the past 8 years, the share of India's export of CBAM covered steel items to EU in India's total export of steel to the bloc has been in the range of 84% to 89%. So that is pretty much, almost whole steel sector exports that is covered under CBAM already. And here we are showing the World Bank index that indicates that India is one of the most vulnerable countries in the steel sector. Now, what strategic options do steel companies in India have? I think because of the paucity of time, I would not explain in greater detail. but it would depend on various factors like what is the company size, their resources, capability, preparedness, their carbon intensity, as well as exposure to EU market. This particular slide is showing that how they can strategize. I can explain it later if there is time. Now, one point I would like to mention here is that one thing that came up very clearly that whenever we are talking about India's exposure to EU market and impact of CBAM, one has to keep in mind that India has a huge domestic market for steel, and that is one fallback option which companies can explore, and perhaps they are already exploring that. However, if they plan to explore other destinations, these green, highlighted items indicate these are European Union countries, but there are other different destinations where India is already exporting. So India can explore whether they would like to export more and whether that is possible. But do not expect that that is also going to be very easy because you have to keep in mind that you have China, and China is not only the huge largest producer, but there are a lot of issues in terms of competitiveness we all are aware of. What is the impact of UCBAM in terms of Brussels effect? Again, very briefly. At the company level, we found that, as Kaushik mentioned, there are big companies. So these are some of the big companies, and we covered many of them. So one thing that came up very clearly that it is not that they are not undertaking, decarbonization measure. They have been doing that long before CBAM came into being. However, given the very short window between, when CBAM was introduced and when, like in January 2026, CBAM is going to be applied in full-fledged form. This is a very short window that the companies have been facing to deal with this measure. It is not easy for them to completely transform their entire production to decarbonize it at an advanced stage. That is not possible. So what they are planning to do, and this is based on our primary data, they are rather strategizing to deal with it in a manner that they might bifurcate their production. One part that is planned to be exported to you, they might go for decarbonizing faster, and another part which is meant for the domestic market as well as other elsewhere in the world where there is so far no such CBAM kind of measure. Then that particular part may be decarbonized at a slower pace. What about MSMEs? Kaushik already mentioned, and this is exactly what we found in our study, that MSMEs are nowhere prepared to deal with CBAM. And they are very vulnerable and likely to get impacted very adversely. We could not find any conclusive evidence regarding Brussels' effect on the regulators as well as the policymakers, at least in as far as our study is concerned. So what may be the policy implications? There comes this question that uh, you have to keep in mind that it is not the EU only that is actually coming up with CBAM. UK has already introduced. There are discussions going on in Australia, Canada, Taiwan, even in US. There have been bills. So keeping those in mind, if you look at the policy implication, our suggestion were that it is very important that CBAM imposing countries keep in mind the impact of such measure on their trade partners. And if it is like they are really willing to help the trade partners to decarbonize faster, then they can actually come up with, finance, technology transfer, and capacity building support. And here are some of the suggestions regarding the design element. One is carve out for the SMEs. Second is technical and capacity building support. Then revenue recycling, very controversial, not introduced in the EU CBAM design, but we proposed it, and negotiated protocol on measurement, reporting, verification, and interoperability. These are technical terms. We can get into further details. And this week itself, there have been very important developments regarding MRV, but perhaps we can get back if there are some such questions that are coming up. So that brings us to the question of that whether there is scope for going for and exploring collaborative and cooperative approaches in this space, because if there are different countries and jurisdiction coming up with similar measure with different design elements, then it is the exporters who are going to face the brunt of it, and exports are going to get impacted, particularly from developing and least developed countries. They are likely to be most impacted. So that is what we'd like to mention. There are some caveats which are mentioned in our paper, but due to paucity of time, I'm not reading out. I stop at that. We have already spent close to 35 minutes. Thank you very much. We look forward to the our esteemed panelists' comment and their presentations. Thank you.
Uh, thank you so much, Professor Kaushik and Professor Kasturi, for sharing your research paper findings. I can see that they're sorry. I can see that there are clear challenges for Indian steel companies to keep up with the stringent CBM requirements, and you just made the case for like what policy design. You just raised the question, but what appropriate policy design could address these serious challenges, which are right in this time, which we are facing. So I now invite our first panelist, Dr. Prerna, to share her views on the presentation.
Thanks, Swati. Thanks, Dr. Das and Dr. Bandyopadhyay, for a wonderful paper. I hope I am audible. Okay. Great. So I've been hearing about CBAM since, it has come into force or conceptualized. But then, yeah, this work actually talks about, the practicality of it in terms of, what does it imply for the Indian industry? Because I engage a lot with the Indian industry and the challenges that they face. So I read a lot of that in the paper. So that was really good for me, the Brussels effect, and also the heterogeneity, that you talk about between the large firms and the smaller firms, because that actually, as Dr. Bandyopadhyay mentioned, it's actually the challenge, the real challenge for the Indian economy, the Indian industry. This division that we have, the large ones and the smaller ones, because the larger ones, they generally feel easy and better to comply with any regulation, be it an Indian regulation or a regulation from other countries. So that heterogeneity is there, and it's a genuine concern. Um, Also, this takes me back to a paper that I did, a few years back on sustainability-driven non-tariff measures, where I didn't only focus on CBAM, but other EU-related regulations, and I calculated the exports from India that are at risk because of these regulations. So most of the chunk that was at risk, our exports that were at risk came from CBAM, but then there were other regulations as well, because EU, as we all know, is a leader in imposing these regulations. So there are multiple sectors that are at risk, including the textile sector. And at that time, I engaged with a lot of industry players, as you did, for the sustainability regulations. And the message that I got was exactly the same, that they are not prepared. So, for instance, I worked on, I picked up a sector which was textile sector, and there's a regulation in the EU jurisdiction which is going to track the entire supply chain of textile and apparel, whether it is reusable, circular, and all of that. But then our MSME players, they do not even understand this language. Forget about complying with these regulations, like something like digital passports and all of that. So they are just not prepared. So that is the first challenge. So what do we do? But then at the same time, I believe that it's an opportunity to decarbonize to for our net zero goals. Definitely, it's an opportunity. But what lies in the way is something that we need to look at. And I'll take a different perspective, because recently, for the last few years, I've been working on competitiveness challenges in the Indian industry. So I'll talk from that perspective, because you have touched upon the decarbonization and the sustainability part of it. But I feel that the steel sector anyway is not very competitive, and if you'll see, it's the most protected sector from the global economy. So there are core competitiveness challenges that are there in the steel sector in the Indian economy. And if we add something like an external regulation like CBAM, I would not think that it would be desirable for already uncompetitive players. Uh, to comply with such a regulation, and that would be a problem. So to go there, I feel that we need to rectify those fundamental challenges first. Challenges that you mentioned about technology, for example. Why are we not able to progress or adopt, advanced technologies? That is the first question, which is a supply side barrier. Completely agreed. Then the social barriers in terms of heterogeneity. Because of that, there's a huge extent of firm concentration that we see. There's this pricing power, resources availability power in the hands of few firms, which leads to lesser competition and uncompetitive outcomes as such. And because of all of this, they keep themselves protected. So one important factor here, which I feel is, high trade barriers that we see in this sector, that creates a cycle. So because we are uncompetitive, we will demand high trade barriers and we will stay uncompetitive. Why? I'll just explain. So what I've seen in the steel sector is that we are reliant on a lot of inputs from the other countries, but then we keep it highly protected through trade barriers. So this makes the final product that the firms are producing uncompetitive. And if we add the CBAM penalties to it, definitely it's going to be undesirable, especially for the smaller players. Secondly, the capital or the technology required. I'll just give one example. So I've been recently working on something called quality control orders, which is kind of a trade barrier because it's like what regulations you see in the EU jurisdiction. So I have focused a lot lately on quality control orders and how they are equally applicable to the domestic production and to the imports coming to the country. And there was a CSEB working paper recently that showed that it leads to a huge disruption in the imports coming to the country without leading to much export gains. And you would not believe there is a quality control order even on an electrolyzer, which is a very important input for green hydrogen production that goes into green steel production. So if we put such barriers, probably the idea is to ensure self-sufficiency, but then if we put such barriers, how can we expect to expedite our decarbonization efforts? So in that sense, I would feel that I don't know where these trade barriers would fit in those challenges, slide. I would feel that it's a regulatory challenge. I don't know, but in those four pillars, where would it fit in accurately? But then this is one important factor that makes the steel sector uncompetitive. But then the story that I hear from the industry is the other way around. Because we are uncompetitive, we need this protection. But according to me, as a trade economist, I feel it's totally the opposite way. So yes, that's my first intervention, that this needs to be accounted for if we want to make this CBAM compliance desirable for even the smaller or the medium players. Otherwise, this will just aggravate the firm concentration that we already have. The larger players will keep complying, but then the smaller players will be out of the ambit of this possibly or potentially good opportunity. So that's the first thing. And second, on the policy recommendation on revenue. So this is not my forte again, but then there was a recent, it's a working paper by CSEP in the pipeline. It's a forthcoming working paper, but then because we keep presenting it internally, so there's a very good recommendation to think about how some revenues from the existing fossil taxes can be diverted to decarbonization efforts. So there was a suggestion that because the GST compensation cess on coal has been discontinued and the GST on coal has now been increased. So how can this additional GST revenue be recycled or rerouted for the decarbonization effort? So I think that was a wonderful policy recommendation that I saw for a revenue, because revenue, yeah, how do you support fiscally the decarbonization effort is a question. But then this was another idea that I thought that I'll discuss. That's all, these 2 points from my end, but wonderful. Would want to engage more on it. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Thanks a lot. Very, very
Points.
important and valuable points. and we can actually keep on discussing. Thank you very
Sure.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.
To Dr. Prerna. Now, I like to invite Ms. Saparna to present her views and comments on this research.
Yeah, so firstly, very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to ISD and a wonderful presentation from Dr. Kasturi, Professor Kaushik. Firstly, it is also an opportunity for me to thank them. Especially Dr. Kasturi has also been part of the review process for our own work around CBAM, which was more qualitative in nature and looking at more of a strategy from a carbon pricing perspective. So, my reflections firstly, I come from a research background of carbon markets. And if we look at the CBAM debate, the genesis of it comes from the whole EU ETS policy that has been placed since 2005. And some of the literature that we had assessed during our thematic analysis was around when did EU start preparing on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which date back to more than a decade, starting from 2010 onwards. And Dr. Kasturi very well highlighted that the motivation of the CBAM has been one is to curb the carbon leakage, but at the same time also provide the level playing field for the companies that are already part of the EU's ETS process, and they have been since 2005. Uh, so, as part of our thematic analysis, where we were looking at what are the possible responses for the Indian government or how to make this transition still more suitable to the current stage of the processes that our steel and the aluminum industry are. The first and foremost point was on the carbon pricing mechanism. Now, today that we know that within the omnibus simplification package that EU has come out with, it does recognize the effective carbon price being paid in a third country, which means that if there is a current carbon price, if you do have a workable emission trading scheme or a carbon tax, there is an opportunity for you to get certain concession or a reduction against the CBAM levy. Now, the issue here is that the India's ETS is an intensity based in terms of its design, and that's possibly because of the reason that we are a growing economy. We don't want to tap the overall production. We want to keep growing until the time that our emissions peak. And for the EU, current design is on absolute. But if still we see that the price, we are currently in the first compliance cycle of our ETS, steel companies are part of this ETS and its compliance cycle. The simulation, the analysis reveals that the price of a credit in the market is going to be somewhere modest around $8 to $15. And what we see an average in the EU's ETS is, and what the CBAM levy would be for one output of for 1 ton of carbon dioxide would be around 80 to 85 euro. So the difference is quite large. Now, here, even if we have a carbon pricing mechanism, when the steel companies are graduating a, from a transitional to a definitive period, that is starting January, they will have to, in any case, pay the full 85 euro in the European market. What is the way out? Even if you have a starting mechanism, currently we don't see ourselves eligible for a full rebate on the carbon price. The second option here is that if you allow for Article 6 credit, we see that offsetting has been one of the mechanisms that have been allowed by EU ETS during the CDM time by its firm. So I think Article 6 mechanism, and I wouldn't go in a lot of details of it, but currently 6.4 is operational for private sector. So what bilaterally could be a solution, and there are certain platforms that we keep thinking is that it might just be that EU would allow some offsetting, if not complete, but certain percentage. So I think that will be a more forward looking approach. One is because if we have companies investing in Article 6 credits, we would have one, there is technology update that happen within the country itself. And second, we also see that the money, the buying of the credits also remains within the country. So that is one way forward for the companies that are currently being hit by the CBAM. Second is that the bilateral approach we have within the Article 6, government is thinking around having partnerships on green hydrogen per se. But again, the question is the challenge is that whether the corresponding adjustments here on Article 6 would mean that if we are, because green hydrogen, producing green steel through that mechanism is an expensive approach, you are taking technology through the Article 6 mechanism for, say, for example, from Germany, and then you're giving corresponding adjustments of the credits to the buyer country, which means that if you're selling your steel to any country abroad, it's not green steel. Even though the technology is green, it is going to be accounted for gray steel. So here, the challenge is that it would mean for Indian companies to themselves invest, and the clarity will have to be made that whether this should be through an Article 6 approach or not. Now, my second point is, again, I mean, I'll not go a lot into detail of MRV and the issues on traceability, embedded emissions. Uh, uh, Professor Kasturi already highlighted, also Prerna mentioned that when we look at the MSME, they have no idea how badly they are going to be impacted. One is because of the fact that currently, by the volume of it, some of the MSMEs are not included by how the calculation is a part of the CBAM. But that doesn't mean that they will not be in the future. What current policy of EU looks like is that by 2034, they are planning to completely phase out on free allowances within the EU's ETS, which would mean that they would include all scope 1, 2, and scope 3 emissions and more sectors within the scope of the CBAM. So you would see, in fact, the MSMEs, because they are very much part of the value chain, will be heavily, and many more sectors besides steel being impacted by that. So a green transition is currently not a choice. It will become a definite need. And quickly, my other point on the response strategy, and I saw within the presentation also, Dr. Kastrud mentioned that whether we should channelize our exports into other value chains. So that could be a possible strategy, at least to look at in the short run. But as we know today, India is in its 14th round of the EU FTA negotiations that are happening. And I'm sure this is a key topic of discussion, that where do we stand in terms of the bilateral approach? What is the response strategy for India? So one of the things is that we see in many of these climate dialogues, especially when we go to COP, we see there's a discussion around climate coalition, climate clubs. Many of the economies are looking at their own approach towards a counter approach to a CBAM. So you have evolving BCA mechanism, not just as standalone country policies, but countries coming together in coalition to have one carbon price to counter the CBAM or maybe other BCA mechanism from the developed world. But here also, the issue lies that one of the preliminary assessment that we were just doing around that, whether that holds a lot of value. Even if we look at, say, Brazil, India, China, including Japan and South Korea also, of the exports that go to Europe are not quite substantive to say that if we have a counter to the CBAM, that would be more lucrative for us in terms of rerouting of the revenues or the levy. So here, whether we are looking at a counter BCA kind of policy, or we are looking at a coalition through CBAM, or we are looking at mechanisms beside trade to counter, that will have to be looked at more in depth through a cooperative approach. engaging again with EU currently to enable the MSMEs at least to uh, do their own MRV, calculate on the embedded emissions will also uh, be a good exercise to strengthen our own capacity building. And yeah, I mean, besides that, I think more from the trade context, I will not give my points here because most of those Professor Kasturi has already mentioned. I think I'm already up my 10 minutes, so I'll pause now and maybe could come later. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Excellent points, and we can again, keep on discussing, and very important points you have raised, and very interesting to think about Article 6 and all that. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
can't
you.
agree more.
Sorry, sir.
Can't agree more. I think that's a fundamental points that she has raised already.
Yeah, yeah. Let us finish with our third panelist. Then the discussion, anyways, will start both
Sure.
ways. So I now invite Dr. Anjali to share her comments.
But we can't have the privilege of tea and samosa during the discussions.
We can share some online applauds with you through our emoticons, etc. So
No,
I must.
needed. Samosas are needed. It's winter evening.
Okay. For that, we invite you to please drop into our campus. You're most welcome. We'll be happy to host you. So let me begin by complimenting both the authors. It is my first opportunity to interact with both of you today. And please trust me that it has been a very pleasant and a very intellectually engaging opportunity one. I'm also glad to share that both the discussants who have just finished their discussion are either my former colleagues or my friends. So I'm very happy to be in a very closed room today. I must start by stating that the paper, we're having this discussion on the paper at a very appropriate time, which on a paper which is at the intersection of climate change, trade policy, and also industrial transformation. So we're in December, and we're walking fast towards the expiry of the transition phase of the CBAM. Indeed, no other timing could have been more appropriate to have a discussion on this paper. The paper is already published, and I do not have any very critical comments on that, except for that. The first thing that I must acknowledge is that the stakeholder approach is something that is very impressive. In fact, at a lot of work which we are doing at the Institute for over the last 2 to 3 years in the context of decarbonization and approaching low carbon transition pathways, we are also adopting to a lot of stakeholder consultations. So a lot of sectoral studies have adopted this approach. Indeed, iron and steel is no exception to that, particularly because till time we have hardcore quantitative numbers and figures to do some number crunching. The best way is to talk to different people, whether they are engineers or scientists or business practitioners, and you get a different perspective from all different angles. And that's how the study is quite comprehensive in its insights. So for me, two things probably would have been uh, more supportive as a reader, more for a less informed reader, rather for a casual reader. So if there is a one illustrative exercise of giving some number crunching of, say, for instance, we have just about 5 to 6 major steel players who are potential stakeholders in the CBAM process. So if just one of them, for instance, I picked up the web and I could figure out from GSW some annual report, and I could see how their emission intensity has been going down over a period. So if there would have been some illustrative computation of this much of tonnage of steel which is impacted in CBAM being traded at a price of, say, about 80 pounds per 80 euros per ton would have costed them this much extra. So this is the kind of profits or investment which is at stake, would have been much more convincing to motivate the study. And Now, and yes, in fact, the small table during your presentation, which was talking about some 5, 6, 7 companies, that slide which you showed in the presentation today, I'm quite glad to have seen it. I, although didn't see it in the paper which was sent to me as part of the circulation. So that's a very appropriate addition to bring in some industry, some firm level things. Now, having said that about the paper in its present shape, the question that comes to my mind, and I would frame my rest of my discussion in that direction, is what next? So from the paper, it comes out very clearly that the Brussels effect is not very distinct in the Indian context. And it's not very clearly even for the large firms. It's only partially what is happening because they are only controlling for the amount they are going to send to the EU. Now, this then turns the needle back towards us in-house. What is it that we are doing? So what is our approach? Which is a very intriguing question, and this is something that I have myself been following at the institute for over last few months, and I draw some findings from that ongoing work. So, if it's not the Brussels effect, if it's not the EU CBAM, which is magnificently impacting our initiatives to decarbonize our steel sector, then what is it that is happening? And as I just happened to talk about some annual reports data, we see, which was also acknowledged earlier in the discussion today, that the initiatives of our firms started showing up much earlier than 2023, when the CBAM's transitional phase was formally announced. That means something else is there which is far more effective than the external world for our own business. One part of the story then comes to what is our internal policy dynamics through which we have successfully pushed at least some of our firms into the greening pathways, etc. And there it is important, it just might be important to see what specific dimensions have played a key role. So for instance, in the Indian context, if you compare with EU, we are quite distinct in terms of they having a legacy in expenditures on established legacy on intensive expenditures on R&D. We do not. We have identified the gaps, but we haven't succeeded in filling those gaps ever. But despite that, of whatever little effort is happening here, why is it happening? We are not subsidizing directly through financial incentives, which is something which is happening in the EU. Also under the ETS, the free allowances are a camouflage form of that itself. But these kind of things haven't happened in Indian context. So there is something else which is pushing this. And in my view, based on my work, I feel that it has a lot to do with the way the government is regulating and establishing and strengthening its institutional structures. For instance, Professor Kaushik happened to talk about the green taxonomy. This is a wonderful step that has come up. And probably through these things, the government is giving strong and clean signals for the long-term transition to the business. And that's why they are indulging into this transitional process on their own. Another part of the story of this transition for CBAM could be if one gets to see, are those products which are being exported, those steel products under CBAM, are they value-added goods compared to the less value-added goods? And the story probably is there. Because if that small part of exports of steel items are customized profiles of pipes and tubes, etc., which are generally or coated materials, which are also being incentivized for domestic production through the PLI for specialized steels. So that's another dimension, policy dimension from the Indian government that kicks in here. It could be that these things are triangulating in a very effective manner through which Indian industry is trying to cope up in the external markets. And on your findings, they are all very relevant and helpful. if I were to add something, I would say that something of we sit down on the negotiating table a lot of times and we walk back without the FTA being signed, and we don't know what coverage in the FTA would be. So maybe if we negotiate for what is called as MRAs, mutual recognition agreements, which have helped a lot in sanitary and phytosanitary, sectors, food items. So maybe if some kind of MRAs work for greening of steel or some CBAM sectors, it could be an early relief or a facilitating factor for our exporters. And there was one more important thing which I'm tending to miss out reading from my own script. But if I tend to remember, I'll surely either write back or
No
I'll.
worries, no worries. We can always catch up later. I think these are very, very valuable points, and I think at least we
Excellent.
got a first fantastic critique of our paper. That's wonderful, actually.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you so much. Just one moment, Swati. Dr. Anjali, thank you so much for, you very, what should I say, very humbly put your points, but all your points are extremely valuable and thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm glad if it helps. And once my work is ready, I would be happy to share it across to you.
Definitely, definitely. Look
thank
forward.
you to all speakers for especially keeping the time and for this very, very enriching discussion. I now formally invite our authors to respond to the comments and suggestions of the three panelists. You may keep it within 5-7 minutes so that we can have some time to open the floor for discussion to our web audience.
Okay. So let me, since just now, Dr. Anjali completed her presentation and comments. So let me just share my thoughts, and Kaushik, you might add, then we go back, backwards. So I think this, first of all, I'd start with this particular thing, that what is actually working and what is making them do what they're doing. It's a very important point. And of course, there are, you talked about the, incentives and different incentive structures, the institutional developments that are happening in the Indian context. Of course, these are very, very important things. We did not get a lot of scope in this paper to get into these, because as you know, when we submit to journal, they always come back with size, and we started with a far longer version, but we had to prune it. Still, it was more than what they wanted, but somehow they allowed. So that is one of the things. But we tried to look at it. So in this paper, our focus is mostly on CBAM and external influence, and that too only CBAM. But to my mind, if we look at before CBAM, it is not that there were no external influence at all. Yeah, I think so. You make me think. One is, of course, CBAM is a unilateral measure, but we have been part of the Paris Agreement, right? And we have our nationally determined contribution. We have our own net zero target of 2070, which has, induced our steel ministry to come up with the target for the steel sector. So if you look at, the way they have planned, this is one of the very important development, that when India took this net zero target and then Steel Ministry came up with its own roadmap, that is one of the things that I think sent the signal. So again, that is something of a thing that is coming from the external influence. That is one. But apart from that, we need not only look at it is, again, it is my thought. Kaushik might have different thoughts. We may not only confine to trade-related measures. If you look at the ESG space, for instance, there is so much of pressure that is also coming from the ESG space. And there is so much development within country as well as outside. So much pressure increasingly from the investors. So those are also good enough reasons for big companies to pull up their socks and start working towards decarbonization. And if we look at our companies, they have different companies are differently placed, big companies, I'm saying. And no one company like JSW cannot be compared with Tata Steel because they are very different in terms of how they are situated. And Tata Steel has not only operation in India but in Europe and UK and all that. JSW has a huge, share of their output which goes to export. So very differently placed, and SAIL is more domestic oriented. So although these are big companies, but they are differently placed. But I think what is important is in different ways they have been undertaking measure like internal carbon pricing is one way of doing it, and there are various others. So we need not only think of CBAM as the only thing that might induce, definitely not. And in fact, our findings tell us that that has not really so far been working in a very positive way. Rather, it is more, more like punitive way of looking at it rather than incentivizing. So these are my thoughts. Kaushik, if you would like to add on, Dr. Anjali's thoughts, and then take it forward from there.
Yeah, I think since you have mentioned two pointers, I think your mutual recognition agreement, I think I must say that Kasturi raised this issue with the EU delegation itself. Kasturi raised this issue with the EU delegation itself when we went to make our presentations in Brussels last year. So I think then I think this was the only issue which was raised, that why suddenly this would be imposed unilaterally without any mutual recognitions between these two. That was one of the concerns which we raised, which seems to have augured well with some of the participants there, but you know as well that whatever they intend to, they would do, and it would come anyway. And I must, and second point is about the quantitative issue. We actually wanted to carry that out, but due to the in the interest of time, and particularly looking at even the ISPs and MSMEs, there are problems with respect to the data that we could not get in the context of MSMEs, because the data is not available in the public domain. So we we tried to get it or extract it from the joint steel that people, yeah, and even the steel mint and big steel mint and also steel orbis and all these various sources, but we could not get a very comprehensive source of data. So given these constraints, and you rightly said that now perhaps my PhD students is applying systems dynamics or GCAM model to find out that what implications will CBAM have progressively. But at that point of time, we actually, and you have rightly said, we didn't have much armor in our hand to kind of come out with something, but we felt that the best way to go would be to interact directly with the C-suite level executives primarily, and some scholars who are trade scholars who have been working in the area for quite some time would be the right way to actually take the plunge. And that's why we thought that that would be the right kind of approach. But in fact, I must say that I have a lot more thoughts, but still I am looking forward to your paper and the thoughts that you have kind of assembled in what you intend to bring out. And in fact, once you share that with us, perhaps we would educate myself more in terms of what you're bringing out further in terms of like you would say beyond CBAM. It's a better way to look at it.
Yes.
So looking forward to that. And my response to Prerna, I think you have rightly pointed out two things. In fact, we are not actually having a single WAMI, but a triple WAMI. We have we have a safeguard quota, we have an anti-dumping duty, all are being imposed on steel sectors. I don't know how, we're going to grapple with that. And obviously, you were saying that we are actually entering a vicious cycle, because in the process of just making the sector more competitive, we're actually making it more uncompetitive. That's a vicious cycle which we are yet to deal with. Your interesting comment on particularly the point of even CSF has come out with another interesting paper which talked about the fact that why can't we have a tax in the country itself so that we can keep the revenue with ourselves. Like, so I think there were suggestions in terms of some suggestions which came from, I think, one very former director of ICRIAR, who happens to have done the study. So I think he categorically pointed that out. So I found that interesting. But that tax anyway, it's we think about a double dividend approach, because you see that when we were trying to do away, for instance, with the cess on coal, the first important thing that came into our mind is that if a cess on coal was actually introduced, how the cess was actually going to be used, whether the intended purpose for which the cess was created at the first go, did it really serve that? So when we talk to the ministry and officials, and like in the process of seeing the evaluations which was carried out by National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and also Center for Budget and Government Accountability, we found out categorically that the money was spent for the health and education sector, rather not on the renewable energy sector and energy efficiency sector. So I have my clear concerns with respect to that. It's not just a question of having a tax, but how the revenue is going to be utilized, which I think Professor Anjali has also mentioned, that whether the revenue is actually being steered in the right directions or not. So those are the kind of concerns which I'm having, but I completely agree with all the points which you have raised. Fantastic. Coming to Swati's point, I think very, very important issue about the bilateral, the offsets, in fact, but offsets, that one of the questions and concerns, and you already know that we are having. In fact, CCTS is currently has kept the compliance part clear, but the offset part completely out of the way when I talk to the BE, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, because there are issues of integrity that currently they're grappling with. And once they have it in place, and there are huge issues with respect to the forestry offsets and all the stuff that is creating a huge amount of problems when it comes to offsets actually being considered by you as a part of it. This is my take, and things. I mean, ICP, of course, I think we have been kind of harping onto that CBAM should not be the only, CCTS should not be the only way, because even reach that stage where we are at a level playing field in terms of CCTAs. The interoperability question doesn't even arise at all. So possibly one needs to wait another few more years till actually we arrive at a price which seems to be competitive with the EU. So then I think we can think of it. So I don't really know. Perhaps, as you have rightly said, the burden now completely falls on us. But ISPs might have thought a strategy because they already have started their green steel productions, and most of them, JSPL, in fact, JSW, in fact, to extent, SAIL also, to some extent, when I was talking to them. SAIL doesn't export though, but JSPL, Jindal Steel, Stainless Steel, these guys actually have gone into green steel productions in a very big way. So it would be worthwhile saying that how that get netted out. So as time passes by, as time elapses, and as we get to see the developments in the next few months, perhaps, and currently also there's a discussion on default value that is going on, which is punitive, as Karan was talking about. So I think as in the next few months, I think we shall be able to have a more clearer directions in terms of where we are going. And perhaps I'm looking forward to that. Custody, if you could respond, that's where I would like to end. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Kaushik. But you have already responded to a lot of issues. I have very briefly. I'd like to point out a few things to Prerna. Very important points you raised about whether we are making ourselves less and less competitive. That's a very important point, and I think it is important, and that is something we touched upon, that see, we can think of exploring different other destinations. Now, EU is not alone. It is increasingly going to be explored in different other jurisdictions like UK, etc. We already mentioned those. So, for how long you will expect that you can get away doing nothing? It cannot be done. So we need to have, I think, more proactive strategy, even for the MSMEs, in my view. And I was informally talking to someone from one particular MSME company, which is a relatively big company, and they were of the view that which is not part at all of this study, and beyond that. So they were of the view that they also operated with a very thin margin, MSMEs in India, even in the domestic market, and whether their clients are ready to pay the higher price, because if they are facing the competition among the other MSMEs who are competing with them, then even if they try to do more and do better in terms of decarbonization, then they face the competition, and their clients may not be willing to buy from them and go to somewhere else. Now, what is the solution for that, which is a genuine problem? So not only that capacity constraint is a problem, not only that funding is a problem, but also this competition that they face. And as some of you mentioned, that it is a sector which is not very competitive and like that. Now there comes this question that what government need to do in terms of regulation, so that they are under pressure, and it's not that only one MSME is trying to do something and then they are lagging behind. Then they also need a level playing field among different competition. So that is something, just a thought I'm sharing. And to Aparna, again, very important points, and thank you very much for, acknowledging. And it was lovely reading your paper. Ours is focused on steel, but yours were, more widespread in terms of overall scenario. I really enjoyed it, and I have seen the publication that has come up. So congratulations to you and team on that. I'd like to mention that, regarding Article 6, it is, as we know, that it is just at a developing stage. It is coming up in a big way. So we have to really wait and see, how far we can exploit that. So, but that's a very important thing you have mentioned. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Kasuri ma'am has finished, or she would like to add something?
I developed this carb, so I stopped. Yeah, just wanted to mention, I stopped because I didn't want to cough. To complete the point I was raising, I had done a study on clean development mechanism and technology transfer under that. And that was something like, that was published when I was a visiting fellow in University of East Anglia, and later also published in another top journal together with my co-authors. Now, why I'm mentioning this, you talked about, Aparna, about the technology aspect of Article 6. So I would take it little bit with pinch of salt, because there I could see what I did is I looked at first 1,000 CDM projects that were registered, and I developed an operational definition of technology transfer and tried to apply it to the findings. I created a database and applied it there. And what I could see is that the kind of technology related developments that were happening from developed countries towards developing countries under CDM, it was at a very basic stage. I mean, even only most of the cases, I don't recall all the data now, but most of the cases, it was only import of technology, not even operation and maintenance related knowledge that was shared. Forget about more advanced, transfer of knowledge and technology. Because if we look at technology transfer, the way it is thought of, as you would know, that there are very different approaches about how technology transfer is defined. One is, of course, neoclassical approach, which would focus more on, import of technology. But then there are alternative approaches which are more relevant for developing countries, which would talk about development of capacities back home through the not only import of technology. So from that angle, I'm saying we really have to see that how this Article 6 mechanism 6.4 gets implemented, and whether the countries like India has already approved some of the methodologies, but going forward, how it is going to look at this aspect. And it mentions technology transfer as part of the sustainable development goals, etc. So we have to really wait and see whether that happens, and whether it's a very interesting thought that whether that can be somehow, combined with CBAM. We never thought about it. So thank you very much for sharing that thought. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Kaushik and Kasuri ma'am. So now we can just open the floor for any comments, questions to the authors, or anybody can just raise their digital hands to pose their questions. Yes, please unmute Mr. Swatrik Goswami. You can just identify yourself quickly and just pose your question and name the panelist to which you are posing the question. Please unmute.
Yeah. Hello, am I audible now?
Yes.
Yes, it was not allowing me to sorry. Thank you so much Professor Bandyopadhyay and Professor Das, I had actually read your paper quite a long back because I am myself working on climate and trade. I'm with the Sustainable Futures Collaborative Climate Policy Team.
Nice.
Thank you.
And
Nice.
also with CBGS, since Professor Bandyopadhyay mentioned, I erstwhile worked there as well.
That's great.
So I had just a couple of two questions. So I was looking at the MSME problem, and what I was also looking at is basically there's a 50 tons exemption rule, which is basically now there from the EU. So if the production capacity of the export is basically less than 50 tons, then CBAM won't be applicable. So most of the MSMEs which are there in the country right now, they do not have that amount of production. So, but in the future, there is a possibility that they are also going to export. So, in your view, is it a question of their impact being more from the value chain perspective or from the export perspective in the future? That is the first question. Second question, beyond the capacity, beyond the technology, what I was trying to look at is the kind of effect from a policy perspective which the MSMEs can be prevented with. So, what will be the key areas which you think are the gap right now, and what I can look for furthermore where MSMEs can be basically gone and talked to, and the kind of research which is needed there? That's all.
If there are any other questions, we can just collect them all from the floor, or I don't think there are any. So you can just proceed with the response.
Kaushik, would you like to start?
Just go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, fine. Shotrik, thank you so much and we are happy that you read the paper. And thank you. These are not only questions, but very, important comments that you have shared. I'd like to mention that, MSMEs, the exemption you were talking about, the, 50 ton, as far as I think it is applicable for the importers in EU, if I'm not mistaken, and not necessarily the, MSMEs in the exporting countries. So I think importers who are importing within and not breaching that particular, threshold, they can get this. But think of this, if that is the case, then think of it that we have an MSME in India who might actually export to different players in EU. And but it is possible for them to still get impacted. And that also brings to the question that whether they are getting impacted, they are supposed to get impacted through the value chain, or it is that they are supposed to get impacted directly. Now, as far as this study is concerned, our understanding from all the stakeholders was that uh, MSMEs are involved in both ways. Some of them are involved directly in exporting to EU, and some of them are in the value chain. So the impact could be both ways. And unfortunately, we could not really collect the actual numbers of MSMEs export to EU. Those kinds of numbers are not available. But we very recently also, would not take name, we were talking to some of the big, and they are also working with the MSMEs through the value chain. They were of the view that MSMEs do have a lot of export directly to EU, and so the recent default values that have come up this week, which has yet to be finalized, will be very important for the MSMEs also. Because how if they are not prepared to come up with their own data regarding their carbon footprint, then they might have to go for using the default values. Their importers might have to go for using the default values, and which may not be really in our favor as far as the MSMEs are concerned, because if that happens, then the default values that have come up, the provisional ones, I'm saying, it appears that they're very high for the Indian steel sector. And so if default values are to be used for the MSMEs, then MSMEs may really be disadvantaged. So I stop at that, Kaushik, if you'd like to add
This
something.
is fine. I think, but within the MSME, you can go for a classifications. So I think that would be worthwhile seeing that. I mean, the one which are actually, if you're looking at the guys who are actually kind of selling their products to the ISPs, the integrated steel players, these are the guys who would somehow be saved because they are being handled by these ISPs. But the guys who are directly exporting or directly exposed, for instance, to the European Union, they are the guys who are going to be crushed. And they have to actually completely bear the brunt of it. So I think so. But as rightly said, we need those data to actually comment on this, because I can only say that this is going to happen, but that's like a kind of I'm just thinking like that, but on the basis of my hunch. But we need those clear data to actually talk about it.
Okay, so if anybody has any other question, they can just type in the chat box or raise their hand. I don't think there are any. So then we can just proceed with the closing of the session. Uh, I especially thank the three distinguished panelists for sharing their views and perspectives on the paper and for enriching the discussion, and especially the presenters for sharing such a novel work, which has raised so many issues. I think a range of significant issues around CBAM implementation and associated challenges for Indian steel industry have been discussed today. Not to forget the several data issues which have actually come up when one really wants to assess the implementation impact, and of course some practical policy hurdles and possible suggestions have been proposed in this discussion. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for this very enriching discussion, and thanks to the web audience for their participation. And we hope that you all will continue your academic engagement with ISID through the research seminar series at future occasions as well. With this, we close the session. Goodbye and good evening from ISID. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank
Thank
you very much.
you.
It was a
Thank you,
pleasure being a part of
everybody.
this.
Bye.
Really enjoyed. Thank you very much.